The rain was coming down hard that night in Seattle, drumming against the windshield of Julian Carter's sleek black Tesla as he navigated the empty road along the riverfront. At 34, Julian was the kind of guy most people envied, sharp, driven, and ridiculously wealthy. As the CEO of Horizon Tech, a company dominating the AI software game, he'd just closed a deal that day to buy out a little startup. Sure, it meant dozens of people were out of jobs, but that's how it worked in his world. Eat or be eaten. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own tired eyes. Success was supposed to feel better than this, wasn't it? He pulled over near the riverbank to take a call, the headlights slicing through the downpour. The voice on the other end was his CFO, rattling off numbers and projections, but Julian's mind was elsewhere. Something about the day gnawed at him, an itch he couldn't scratch. Maybe it was the champagne he hadn't bothered to drink at the office celebration, or the fact that he was driving alone at 11 p.m. instead of toasting with his team. He muttered a quick good work and hung up, rubbing his temples. That's when he saw her. She was just a shadow at first, a small figure standing in the rain, barely visible until his headlights caught her. A girl, maybe 11 or 12, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face. She wore a tattered jacket way too big for her, and her bare feet sank into the muddy gravel. Julian squinted, figuring she was lost or something. Kids didn't belong out here this late, especially not in this weather. She didn't move, just stood there staring at him, or past him, he couldn't tell. Then she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the river, where an old, rusted delivery truck sat half-hidden in the weeds about 20 yards away. "Hey!" Julian called out, rolling down his window. The cold stung his face as rain pelted in. "What are you doing out here? You okay?" The girl didn't answer. She just kept pointing, her wide eyes locked on that beat-up truck like it held the answer to everything. He groaned inwardly. This wasn't his problem. He had emails to answer, a board meeting to prep for. But there was something in her face, desperation, maybe fear, that tugged at him. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his umbrella and stepped out into the storm. The mud sucked at his polished shoes as he trudged toward her. Up close, she looked even smaller, her lips blue from the cold. "What's going on?" he asked, softer this time. She finally met his gaze, and her voice came out shaky but fierce. "He's in there! Please! You have to help him!" Julian followed her finger to the truck again, a chill creeping up his spine that had nothing to do with the rain. "Who's in there?" he pressed, but she just grabbed his sleeve, tugging him forward. "Please," she whispered, "he won't wake up." Julian sighed, already regretting this. Whatever was in that truck, he had a bad feeling it was about to turn his night upside down. Little did he know, it'd do a lot more than that. It'd turn his whole life inside out. The wind howled as Julian slogged through the mud, the little girl clinging to his sleeve like it was a lifeline. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so small, and her urgency made his stomach twist. All right," he muttered, trying to keep the umbrella over them both, though it was useless against the sideways rain. "Let's see what's going on." The old delivery truck loomed ahead, its rusted frame half swallowed by overgrown weeds. It looked like it had been dumped there years ago, abandoned to rot by the river. What the hell was someone doing inside it? The girl, Mia, she'd mumbled her name when he asked, let go of him as they reached the truck, scrambling toward the driver's side door. It hung ajar, creaking on its hinges. "He's in here," she said, her voice cracking with panic. Julian hesitated, peering into the dark cabin. The smell hit him first. Diesel, mildew, and something sour he couldn't place. He fished his phone from his pocket, flicking on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a mess of junk, empty cans, soggy newspapers, a cracked thermos. And then he saw him. A man was slumped in the corner, curled up under a filthy blanket that barely covered his frail frame. His breathing was shallow, raspy, like every inhale was a fight. Julian's heart thudded. "Hey buddy, you okay?" he called, stepping closer. No response. The guy looked bad. Real bad. Gray hair stuck out from under a worn cap and his skin was pale, almost waxy in the harsh light. Julian climbed into the cab, careful not to slip on the wet metal floor, and crouched beside him. Up close, something about the man's face tugged at a memory he couldn't quite grab. Those deep-set eyes, the sharp jawline softened by age. It was familiar, like a song he hadn't heard in years. He reached out, gently shaking the man's shoulder. "Come on, wake up!" Nothing. Julian pressed 2 fingers to the guy's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there. Faint and uneven, but there. Alive, at least. He glanced back at Mia, who'd climbed up behind him, her eyes huge and glistening with tears. "Who is he?" Julian asked, keeping his voice steady. "My grandpa," she whispered. "Frank. He hasn't moved since last night. I tried to get help, but no one stopped." Julian swore under his breath. This kid had been out here alone, in the rain, trying to save her grandfather. He pulled off his coat and draped it over Frank, then turned to Mia. "How'd you get here?" She wiped her nose with her sleeve. "We've been living in the truck. He got sick a few days ago, and yesterday he just stopped talking. I ran to the road to find someone." Her voice broke, and she looked away, ashamed. Julian's chest tightened. Living in this wreck? In March with the cold and the damp? He couldn't wrap his head around it. "Stay here," he told her, pulling out his phone again. He dialed 911, barking out their location to the dispatcher, a stretch of river road nobody bothered with. "Ambulance is on the way," he said after hanging up. Mia nodded, clutching the edge of the blanket like it'd keep Frank tethered to life. Julian studied the old man again, that nagging familiarity growing stronger, and then it hit him, like a punch to the gut. Frank Sullivan. The name snapped into place, dragging a flood of memories with it. Frank had been the head mechanic at his dad's auto shop when Julian was a skinny 16-year-old with big dreams and greasy hands. The guy was a legend. Patient, tough, with a knack for fixing anything with an engine. He'd spent hours teaching Julian how to tune a carburetor, how to listen to a motor and hear what was wrong. "Patience, kid," Frank used to say, his gravelly voice cutting through the clang of tools. "You rush, you ruin." Julian had idolized him back then, soaking up every lesson. But when his dad died and the shop went under, Julian bailed. Left Frank behind to chase a tech degree and a shiny new life. He hadn't even said goodbye. Now here Frank was, half dead in a junked-out truck with a granddaughter Julian never knew existed. The irony was brutal. Julian had built Horizon Tech into a billion-dollar empire, and yet the man who'd helped spark his love for problem-solving was rotting away in this heap. "Hang on, Frank," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. "I owe you this much." The ambulance lights flickered in the distance, cutting through the rain. Julian climbed out, helping Mia down as the paramedics rushed over. They loaded Frank onto a stretcher, oxygen mask strapped to his face, while Mia hovered nearby, small and scared. "You coming with us?" one of the medics asked Julian, eyeing his soaked suit and muddy shoes. He glanced at Mia, then back at Frank's frail figure. "Yeah," he said, decision made. "I'm coming." At the hospital, Julian paced the waiting room while Mia sat curled in a chair, clutching his coat like a security blanket. The doctor came out after what felt like forever. "Severe malnutrition, pneumonia setting in," she said, clipboard in hand. "He's stable for now, but he needs rest and treatment. You family?" Julian froze. Family? He barely knew what that word meant anymore. "I'm covering the bills," he said instead, pulling out his credit card. The doctor nodded. No questions asked. Mia looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would stop." Julian forced a smile, feeling about 2 inches tall. "Don't thank me yet, kid. We're not out of this mess." But as he watched her settle back into the chair, exhaustion pulling her eyes shut, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking away. Not this time. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and regret, a combo Julian wasn't used to. He leaned against the wall in the waiting room, arms crossed, watching Mia doze off in the oversized chair. She looked tiny under his coat, her damp hair spilling over the collar. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. He should have been home by now, sprawled on his leather couch with a glass of bourbon, not stuck here playing Good Samaritan. But every time he thought about bailing, he saw Frank's face, those sunken cheeks, that ghost of a man he used to know, and his feet stayed planted. A nurse came by with a blanket and a cup of hot chocolate for Mia, who stirred long enough to mumble a thank you before nodding off again. Julian caught the nurse's eye. "How's the old guy doing?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Stable," she said, tucking the blanket around Mia. "He's awake now, but weak. You can see him soon if you want." Julian nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for that. "What do you say to someone you abandoned 18 years ago?" He sank into a chair across from Mia, pulling out his phone to kill time. Emails piled up, board updates, investor notes, but his mind kept drifting. How had Frank ended up like this? The guy he remembered was a rock, always in control, hands stained with motor oil and a grin that said he'd seen it all. Julian's dad used to call him the backbone of the shop. And Mia, where'd she come from? Frank never mentioned a family back then. Then again, Julian hadn't exactly stuck around to ask. The doctor's voice snapped him out of it. "Mr. Carter, you can go in now." Julian stood, smoothing his wrinkled suit, and followed her down the hall. Frank's room was dim, the only sound the soft beep of a monitor. He lay propped up in bed, an IV dripping into his arm, looking older than his 68 years, but alive. His eyes flicked up as Julian stepped in, and, for a second, they just stared at each other. Recognition flickered in Frank's gaze, followed by something harder, maybe surprise, maybe resentment. "Julian Carter," Frank rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Didn't expect to see you in a place like this." Julian forced a half smile, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Didn't expect to find you in a junked-out truck either. How you holding up?" Frank coughed, wincing. "Been better. Been worse, too." He nodded toward the door. "That little girl out there? She the one who dragged you into this?" "Yeah," Julian said. "Mia, she's tough. Said you're her grandpa." Frank's face softened at her name. "She's my everything. All I got left." Julian shifted, uneasy. "What happened, Frank? Last I saw you, you were running the shop like a king. Now you're here." Frank's jaw tightened, and he looked away, out the small window where rain streaked the glass. "Life happened, kid. Shop's gone. House, too. Been living in that truck for over a year. Mia's been with me through it all." Julian frowned. "Gone? How? That place was solid." Frank's eyes met his again, sharp despite the fatigue. "Big company came in, bought up the whole block a few years back. Wanted to build some fancy tech hub. Paid us peanuts to get out, and when the money ran dry, so did our options." Julian's stomach dropped. A tech hub? Seattle, 3 years ago. That sounded way too familiar. "What company?" he asked, dreading the answer. Frank shrugged weakly. "Some outfit called Horizon Tech. Ever heard of it?" The room tilted. Julian gripped the chair beside him, his own company's name echoing in his head like a gunshot. Horizon Tech had scooped up half a dozen properties back then for a new data center. His data center, the one that cemented his rep as a tech wunderkind. He remembered signing off on it, barely glancing at the details. Just business, he told himself. But now those details had a face. "Jesus," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Frank, I didn't know, Don't," Frank cut him off, voice firm despite the strain. "Don't start with that. You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You left, Julian, built your empire and forgot the rest of us." The words stung, mostly because they were true. Julian swallowed hard, guilt clawing at him. "I'm here now," he said quietly. "I'm covering the bills. Mia's safe with me tonight. I'll figure something out." Frank studied him, eyes narrowing. "Why? What's in it for you?" Julian didn't have a good answer. Guilt? Duty? Something else he couldn't name? "Because I owe you," he said finally. "You taught me more than you know back then. I should have stuck around." Frank didn't reply, just turned back to the window, leaving the silence to do the talking. Back in the waiting room, Mia was awake, sipping her hot chocolate. She looked up as Julian sat beside her. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice small. "Yeah, kid. He's a fighter, like you." She nodded, clutching the cup tighter. "He's all I've got. Mom's gone, died when I was little. Never knew my dad. Grandpa raised me. When the house went away, he said we'd be fine as long as we had each other." Julian's throat tightened. "How'd you lose the house?" Mia shrugged, staring into her drink. "Some company bought the shop where Grandpa worked. He couldn't pay the bills after that. We stayed with friends for a while, then the truck. He tried to keep me in school, but it got too hard." She paused, then added, "He's proud, you know, never asked for help, even when we were hungry." Every word was a knife twist. Julian leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His company, his decisions, hadn't just taken Frank's livelihood, they'd ripped apart this kid's whole world. And for what? A data center he barely thought about anymore? "You're staying with me tonight," he said, the words out before he could second-guess them. "My place isn't far. You need a hot shower, some food. We'll sort this out." Mia blinked up at him, unsure. "Why are you helping us?" He forced a grin, masking the storm inside. "Because I'm not as big a jerk as I look. Come on, let's get out of here." She followed him to the car, quiet but trusting, and as they drove toward his penthouse in the city, Julian's mind raced. He couldn't undo the past, but he could do something now. The question was what? His place was a stark contrast to the truck, a sleek, modern penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seattle's skyline. Mia stood in the doorway, dripping wet, looking like she'd stepped into another planet. "This is yours?" she asked, wide-eyed. "Yeah," Julian said, kicking off his muddy shoes. "Make yourself at home. Bathroom's down the hall. I'll order us some food. Pizza, okay?" She nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "It's been forever since I had pizza." While she showered, Julian paced the kitchen, phone in hand. He didn't cook, never had time, so pizza it was. But as he placed the order, his thoughts churned. He dug into Horizon Tech's old records on his laptop, pulling up the acquisition files. There it was, Frank Sullivan, listed as a tenant on the property they'd bought out. The payout was laughable, barely enough to cover a few months' rent. He slammed the laptop shut, cursing himself. How many others had he screwed over without a second thought? Mia came back, drowning in one of his old t-shirts, her hair damp and curling. She climbed onto a bar stool as the pizza arrived, and they ate in silence for a while. Finally, she spoke. "You're not like most grown-ups. They don't stop to help." Julian chuckled, though it felt hollow. "Maybe I'm just making up for lost time, kid. Get some rest. We'll check on Frank tomorrow." She nodded, and as she headed to the guest room, Julian knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Julian woke to the sound of rain tapping against the penthouse windows, a gray light filtering through the glass. He'd barely slept, his mind stuck on Frank and Mia and the mess he'd made of their lives. He shuffled into the kitchen, where Mia was already up, perched on a stool with a glass of water, staring out at the city like it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. She looked cleaner, less fragile in the daylight, but there was still a weight in her eyes that didn't belong on an 11-year-old. "Morning," Julian said, scratching the back of his neck. "Sleep okay?" She nodded. "Your bed's huge. I kept thinking I'd fall off." He smirked, grabbing coffee from the machine. "Yeah, it's overkill. You hungry? I can order something." "Pancakes, maybe?" Her face lit up, just a little. "Pancakes sound good?" He placed the order, then sat across from her, the silence stretching out. Finally, he asked, "How's Frank been holding up? Before all this, I mean." Mia traced the rim of her glass with a finger. "He was okay for a while, worked odd jobs after the shop closed, fixing cars, boats, anything he could find. He's good with his hands, but then he got tired a lot and the jobs dried up. He didn't want me to worry, so he'd pretend everything was fine. Said we were on an adventure, living in the truck." She gave a small, sad smile. "He's a bad liar." Julian's chest ached. He could picture Frank, stubborn as ever, trying to shield this kid from the truth. "He's a good guy," he said quietly. "I remember that much." Mia tilted her head. "You knew him? Before?" He nodded, leaning back. "Yeah, a long time ago. He worked with my dad at an auto shop. Taught me how to fix engines, figure out what makes things tick. I was a punk kid back then, 16, full of big ideas. He put up with me." Her eyes widened. "Grandpa never told me that." Julian shrugged. "Guess I wasn't worth mentioning." "I didn't stick around long." He left it at that, the guilt simmering under his skin. The pancakes arrived and they ate in quiet, the clink of forks the only sound. Afterward, he drove her back to the hospital, the city blurring past in a drizzle. Frank was sitting up when they got there, looking rough but alert. His gray eyes tracked Julian as he walked in behind Mia, who ran to hug him. "Hey, sweetheart," Frank said, voice still hoarse but warm. "You doing okay?" She nodded, clinging to his hand. "Julian let me stay at his place. It's fancy, like a movie." Frank raised an eyebrow at Julian. "That's so? You a big shot now, huh?" Julian shoved his hands in his pockets, forcing a grin. Something like that. How you feeling? Frank coughed, waving it off. Like I got hit by a truck? Ironic, right? Docs say I'll live, though. Thanks for footing the bill. Didn't expect that. Julian shifted, uneasy. Don't mention it. Least I could do. Frank's gaze sharpened, like he could see right through him. Why's that? Guilt trip down memory lane? Julian froze, caught off guard. Before he could answer, Mia piped up. He says you taught him stuff, about engines. Frank's expression softened, just for a second. Did I, now? Well, he was a quick learner. Too quick. Ran off before I could teach him the good stuff. The jab stung, but Julian let it slide. Yeah, well, I'm here now. Wanted to talk to you about something. Frank leaned back, skeptical. Go on. Julian took a breath. I looked into what happened, your shop, the house. It was my company, Horizon Tech. We bought the land, pushed you out. I didn't know it was you, but that doesn't change the fact it happened. I want to make it right. Frank's face hardened, a storm brewing in his eyes. Make it right? You think money fixes this? You think I want your pity? Julian held up a hand. Not pity, responsibility. I screwed up, Frank. I can't undo it, but I can help. You and Mia deserve better than that damn truck. Frank's jaw clenched. We've managed. Don't need your charity. It's not charity, Julian shot back, voice rising. It's what's owed. You gave me a start, taught me things I used to build everything I've got, and then I turned around and... He stopped, the words catching. Frank stared at him, unyielding, until something shifted. He sighed, rubbing his face. Sit down, kid. There's something you don't know. Julian pulled up a chair, Mia watching silently from Frank's side. Frank took a shaky breath, then started. Back when you were at the shop, I was tinkering with more than engines. Had this idea, software to diagnose car problems, real basic AI stuff. Wrote it out, rigged a prototype. Your dad saw it, said it was genius. I gave him the plans, told him to run with it if he wanted. Never cared about credit, just wanted to see it work. Julian's blood ran cold. Wait, you're saying... Frank cut him off. After he died, you took off. Next thing I know, Horizon Tech's popping up, making waves with AI diagnostics. Didn't take a genius to connect the dots. That first spark, it was mine, Julian. And you built an empire on it. The room spun. Julian gripped the chair arms, his world tilting. Horizon Tech's flagship product, the AI that put them on the map, started with a clunky prototype his dad had left in a drawer. He'd assumed it was his dad's work, polished it up in college, turned it into gold. But Frank? Frank was the root of it all? Why didn't you say anything? He demanded, voice cracking. You could have sued me, taken a cut, something. Frank shook his head. Wasn't about money. I believed in you, kid. Thought you'd do right by the world with it. Guess I was wrong. The words hit harder than anything else. Julian stood, pacing to the window, rain streaking the glass like tears he couldn't shed. His whole career, his pride, was built on a gift Frank had given him, no strings attached, and he'd repaid it by tearing the man's life apart. I didn't know, he said finally, turning back, but I do now, and I'm not walking away again. Frank's eyes narrowed. What's that mean? Julian squared his shoulders. I'm shutting down projects like the one that hit you. Horizon's got a new fund, helping small businesses we've hurt. And you? I found a garage for sale, old place by the river. I'll buy it, fix it up. Not for me. For you. A partnership, 50-50. You run it, I back it. No handouts, just what's fair. Frank stared, disbelief warring with something softer. You're serious? Dead serious, Julian said. Mia deserves a home. You deserve your craft back. I can't fix the past, but I can damn well try for the future. Mia tugged Frank's sleeve. Grandpa, say yes, please. He's nice. He stopped when no one else did. Frank looked at her, then back at Julian, the fight draining out of him. All right, he said gruffly. We'll see this garage. But don't think this squares us. You've got a lot to prove, kid. Julian nodded, a weight lifting even as another settled in. I know. I'm just getting started." They sat there, the three of them, the beeping monitor filling the silence. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and Julian felt something shift inside him. A spark, not of ambition, but of purpose. He'd built an empire on Frank's idea once. Now he'd build something better, something real, with Frank by his side. And this time, he wouldn't run. 6 months later, the air smelled of oil and fresh paint at River Garage, a modest setup nestled along the Seattle waterfront. The old brick building hummed with life, tools clanging, engines rumbling, and Mia's laughter cutting through it all. Julian stood by the workbench, watching grease off his hands, watching Frank show a teenage apprentice how to adjust a timing belt. At 68, Frank moved slower than he used to, but his hands were steady, his voice carrying that old authority Julian remembered from years ago. The garage wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. A partnership born from hard truths and harder choices. Julian had poured himself into making it work. He'd bought the place outright, sunk his own money into renovations, and split the ownership 50-50 with Frank. No corporate strings, no Horizon Tech logo, just two guys and a dream to rebuild. Frank had grumbled at first, pride still a stubborn hurdle, but Mia's excitement sealed the deal. She'd raced around the empty space that first day, claiming a corner for her office where she now sketched car designs between homework. School was back in her life too, a local middle school, where she'd already won an art contest. Julian grinned, thinking about the framed certificate hanging in their new home. Home. That was the real change. He'd sold the penthouse, too cold, too empty, and bought a house a few blocks from the garage. Nothing flashy, just a cozy 3-bedroom with a porch overlooking the river. Frank and Mia moved in first, and after a few weeks of Frank's quiet nudging and Mia's not-so-subtle hints, Julian joined them. "House is too big for two," Frank had said one night over dinner. "Might as well fill it." So he did. Now, his mornings started with coffee and Mia's chatter, his evenings with Frank's stories over a beer. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the one he'd needed. Horizon Tech had shifted too. Julian axed the predatory projects, redirecting the company toward sustainable tech, stuff that helped communities, not crushed them. The Coastal Renewal Fund, his pet project, was thriving, bankrolling small businesses like the bakery down the street and a fishing co-op 2 towns over. Profits dipped, sure, but the board came around when they saw the PR boost. Julian didn't care about the numbers anymore. He cared about the thank you letters piling up on his desk, the ones that reminded him he wasn't just a suit anymore. That afternoon, the three of them piled into a beat-up Chevy they'd restored together. Julian at the wheel, Frank navigating, Mia in the back with her sketchbook. They drove to the riverbank, the same spot where it all started. The truck was long gone, towed away, but the memory lingered. They parked and walked to the water's edge, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in gold and pink. Mia plopped down with her pencils, sketching the scene, while Frank leaned on a railing, gazing out. Julian stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "You did good, kid," Frank said, breaking the silence. It's more than I figured I'd get back." Julian smiled, a real one, not the polished grin he used to fake. "Couldn't have done it without you, either of you." Mia looked up, grinning. "We're a team now, right?" "Damn right," Julian said, and Frank chuckled, a rare sound that warmed the air. As the sun sank, Julian felt a peace he hadn't known he'd lost. He'd built empires before, but this family, this purpose, was his real legacy. And for the first time, he was home.